It does not mean that the objective data should drive every decision that we make. It's just, I think, useful feedback to better develop also our self-awareness.
Welkom bij de Slimmer Presteren Podcast. Jouw wekelijkse kop koffie met wetenschapsjournalist Jurgen van Teeffelen en ik, middle-aged man in Lycra, Gerrit Heijkoop. Over sport, onderzoek en innovatie. Voor mensen die hun grenzen willen verleggen, maar daarbij de grens tussen onzin en zinvol niet uit het oog willen verliezen. In deze aflevering praat ik met Jurgen over HRV. Wat moet ik er nou mee? Met special guest Marco Altini. Je training afstemmen op je mentale en fysieke fitheid is zinvol. Kennis van je HRV kan hierbij helpen. Maar hoe meet je die het beste en waar moet je precies naar kijken? Wat als je gevoel iets heel anders zegt? En wat te doen met de menstruatiecyclus, een slechte nacht of hooikoorts? We vragen het aan onze special guest, bewegings- en datawetenschapper Marco Altini. Voordat we beginnen, nog even 3 dingen om aan te denken als jij zelf ook slimmer wilt presteren. Nummer 1. Druk nu gelijk even op abonneren, zodat je altijd direct in de gaten hebt wanneer er een nieuwe aflevering online komt. Nummer 2. Weet dat je Jurgen en mij ook kunt boeken voor jouw volgende bijeenkomst als spreker of presentator. Neem gerust eens contact met ons op via de contactgegevens hieronder. En 3. Deze podcast wordt geproduceerd en gesponsord door Live Online Events. Serieus goede content rondom jouw congres of event. Check www.loe.tv voor meer info. Jurgen, goedemorgen.
Goedemorgen.
Het is vrijdag 21 maart. De lente gaat beginnen.
Ja.
En voor ons gaat er ook een lente beginnen, want het is weer tijd voor een aflevering met een gast.
Zeker.
Afgelopen jaar hadden wij vaak Nederlandse wetenschappers in het buitenland.
In den vreemde, ja.
Maar vandaag gaan we een first ever doen in de Slimmer Presteren Podcast. Ik hoop dat al onze luisteraars mee kunnen naar het Engels. Want we hebben het vandaag, is onze gast een buitenlandse wetenschapper. Veel werkzaam in Nederland.
Ja.
We gaan in gesprek met Marco Altini, joining us live from Italy this morning. Marco, welkom.
Good morning.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone.
Yes, welcome in the Slimmer Presteren Podcast, the Smarter Performance Podcast. We're not going to translate everything that we have in the podcast, but the conversation will continue in English. So, Jurgen, this is your opportunity to do a first English pitch. I always ask you about our guests, like who is Marco Altini?
I would prefer to do it in Italian, but okay, I understand. Marco Altini, well, we had an episode already, number 62, on HRV, in which we explained what it is and what it says about the balance between parasympathetic and sympathetic drive.
Yeah, HRV is an abbreviation for heart rate variability. Yes.
And now, and I think that was already 1.5 years ago.
It was in 2021,
okay.
So almost 4 years ago.
So I know there has been a lot of developments going on in HRV and how to use it in, for example, in guided training or for recovery. And we have a lot of listeners that are, well, using HRV or looking at it.
Either deliberately or indeliberately because their smartwatches offers this data.
And then I have a lot of questions how to make the interpretation of the data and how to use them for the training and make adaptations. So I guess it's time to speak to an expert on the topic, and Marco definitely is. He has a master in movement sciences and in computer sciences and PhD in data science.
All of those 3 cum laude, eh?
Oh, yeah.
Cum laude.
And so I think he's the perfect man to address all the questions that we have from our listeners.
Exactly, because that's what we did. We polled our listeners on Instagram this weekend and asked them, what do you want to know about HRV? It's a long list of questions that we're going to go through. Marco is also the founder of the company HRV for Training, or the app HRV for Training that we mentioned in that episode 62. And I've personally been a user for the last 4 years daily of that app. And I do want to underline that this is a non-sponsored episode. We are inviting Marco because of his expertise in HRV. And Marco, let's start with that question. How come for so many years you've been driven to know so much and to dive so deep into this topic, specifically of heart rate variability? Where does that drive come from?
Yeah, I guess maybe it happened a bit by chance. I didn't have a master plan, to study this specific thing when I did my studies. Actually, first, as you mentioned, I studied computer science, and it was a bit of a different background, a different topic. I didn't find anything at that time that would really drive me until I was fortunate enough to end up in a research institute in the Netherlands. So at the beginning, I was studying in Italy, and a professor had a contact in the Netherlands in Eindhoven, where I ended up in this R&D institute where they were developing the first versions of what today we call wearables and devices like, Garmin watches and Oura rings and Whoop bands and all sorts of things. It was 15 years ago, so these things were not on the market. But as a computer scientist, I found very interesting that we could finally use our skills to measure something from the body and then to try to interpret that data in useful ways. And that was a bit how it started. Then I got really interested in what we could measure, which typically was cardiac activity, the activity of the heart. And then heart rate variability is one of the parameters you extract from there. I'd say maybe then this combines also with what I always perceived a bit as maybe a difficulty I had in dealing with stress in general, right? Both professionally and maybe also in training. I'm a bit of an anxious person. I feel different situations, maybe more than the average person. And so that to me was even more interesting. How can I capture this information? How can I use it in ways that maybe I can do better in terms of performance or, even just in day-to-day life? And one thing led to another, and I kept studying. And then after many years, I built the app and the company. And then I got even more interested in the training aspect of things because I was interacting with many people using the technology that were sports scientists or coaches or athletes and things like that. So I went back. At that time, I was living in the United States, and then I came back to the Netherlands. I went to university in Amsterdam again, and then studied sports science. And right now, I just try to put together these words, the technology and the physiology, and keep it very practical and applied for people to use these technologies. So hopefully, I can try to provide some useful input today with the listeners' questions.
Exactly,
I'm sure. Yeah.
I think we should add to the introduction that you're an avid runner and athlete yourself. You are a coach also in practice, guiding other people with this as well. And you're a very active knowledge sharer on your blog and several podcasts. And the link to all of those are definitely also in the show notes of this episode. So those who want to dive deeper can dive in like I've been doing last time.
And I guess you're the ideal subject, experimental subject for your own studies, aren't you? I mean, you're trying different protocols with nutrition or with sleep or with ultra distance or training.
Yeah, for sure. It's been I would say at this point a key part of the process, right? It kept me always interested and engaged in trying things and seeing what happens with my body and my performance and things like that. Just to be clear, a recreational athlete still. I mean, not breaking any records or winning anything. But it's been a fun process, and with small improvements over the years.
Exactly. Now, Marco, let's start with the basics. You already referenced when you said what fascinated you, that heart rate variability might be related to stress, something that personally ticked you. For the last 12, 15 years, you have been explaining this so often. So if someone asks you, but Marco, HRV, what actually does that mean? What is your short answer to that one?
Yeah, when we look at HRV, we look at a proxy of stress. It means that we cannot really measure stress, which is a bit of an abstract entity, and we cannot measure the autonomic nervous system, which is the part of the body that responds to stress. But the autonomic nervous system is modulating heart rate and heart rhythm, meaning also the variability of heart rate. And that is something we can measure. So indirectly, by looking at heart rate variability under certain circumstances, we get an idea of how the body responds to stress. And that's why I think it can be insightful, since we all experience stressors all the time, from training to other aspects of life.
Yeah, because that was my very low-hanging fruit next question. So how is that related to sport stress?
Yes, sports is a stressor, right? So we exercise to stress the body and then trigger a response that can lead to an improvement. I think the application of heart rate variability in the context of training is probably the one that has been developed and applied the most, probably because training is a stressor that we can try to quantify and we can easily adjust, right? So if I have a hard training today, I can decide to do an easier training if I want to lower the stressor. That is not the case if I have maybe a very difficult situation at work or in my family. Like, all other stressors can be much harder to adjust or change, or we might not even be able to do that. And so HRV remains relevant as a way to capture our stress response, but we might have very little power over it sometimes, which can make it even worse sometimes to know that you are so much stressed, right? So training, I think it's nice because it's actionable. You can make adjustments, and it all fits in a way that is easier for people to use it that way. Even though, as we will probably discuss later a bit more, training is just one of the stressors. And when we measure HRV, we don't measure our response to training. We measure our response to everything that we do. So we can never discriminate exactly which stressor is which.
Exactly. Now, we've received a ton of questions, Jurgen. Yep. I've kind of grouped them into 4 chapters.
Yes.
Chapter 1, basic knowledge about HRV. We slightly moved into that one already. Let's take the first question. Next chapter is all about measurements, accuracy, and different devices and ways to measure HRV. Next one is all the different factors that influence HRV, and specifically a lot of our female listeners have submitted questions about what does the menstrual cycle do in relation to HRV, but also other topics like alcohol and other things. How does that influence my HRV? And then the 4th chapter, so what?
Yeah.
Now that I know and monitor my HRV, what do I do with it? How do I make it actionable? So big shout out and thank you to all the question submitters.
Yep.
You want to take the first one?
Yes, Stefan Zegers, Mesui. His question is, how does HRV relate to resting heart rate?
So HRV and resting heart rate are tightly coupled, right? So when heart rate is lower, typically HRV is higher. This is linked directly to how the physiology works, meaning that, again, we said earlier, it's a proxy of the parasympathetic or the sympathetic nervous system activity, so of the nervous system. And in particular, the part of the nervous system that is more active when we are in a phase of recovery or rest is the parasympathetic side of things. When it's active, reduces heart rate and increases variability. So the effect is on both these parameters, and they tend to be very tightly coupled, even though they do not really represent always the same thing, because otherwise we could just use resting heart rate. We would not need to go into heart rate variability, which is a bit more complex to compute, a bit more prone to issues with the measurement and signal quality and things like that. We go through the trouble because HRV tends to be a bit more sensitive to stress. That means that if we face smaller stressors, typically even training-related stress, it might be that our resting heart rate does not change so much. It might change a lot if, for example, we are getting sick. That is a very big stressor. But for smaller things, it might not change much, while HRV might change to a larger degree. And therefore, it's easier to see that, okay, we maybe did not respond well to this stressor, and we might need to implement a change. So eventually, both are useful, right? Because if you see a suppression in HRV, but your heart rate is normal, then you might not worry that much. You say, okay, there is a stressor, but maybe I'm not getting sick, or it's nothing so bad that my heart rate would also be elevated. So I think it's always more useful to look at both of them, but they are slightly different and also highly correlated in many situations.
Yeah, in my experience, HRV might be even a little bit of a predictor, right? So, for example, the example of getting sick, I might already notice something in my HRV levels. And then when you really get sick, the resting heart rate also changes.
Yeah, that can also happen because, in those cases, obviously we maybe do not feel some of the symptoms yet, right? So it's coming up, but your body is already experiencing changes. So there's no magic there. Obviously, the body is already affected, by the virus or whatever that is. But the data allows you to see it maybe a bit earlier that, experience other symptoms, and sometimes that can be useful. Yeah.
So that brings us to the next kind of questions in the area of basic knowledge about HRV. A question of both Nangxia and also Laurie Berge is about how to then interpret those values. Nangxia wrote us, what does a too high HRV mean? And also it then indicates unbalanced. And also Laurie Berge writes, why does Garmin also mark a high HRV in red as if it is something negative? Because as we know, in most indicators like fitness and stuff, the higher the better. But that does not seem the case with HRV, Marco.
Yeah, that's such a great question, because even with HRV, the oversimplification often is that higher is better, right? You hear this a lot, and many of the tools out there actually do not do this particularly well, meaning that they also interpret the data that way. So they will still go with the higher the better, and they will give you a better score. If they use the information to provide you with some readiness or recovery score, they will also provide a better score if it is higher. But as the listeners have highlighted, some tools do interpret a particularly high value as something that could be negative. We do that also with our tool. Garmin does that as well. I think that is a good way to do it, because when we think about the physiology, abnormalities tend to be something to be more cautious about. And we can think about signals that we all know a bit better than heart rate variability. For example, blood pressure, right? Too low or too high is not great. You want to be in this optimal range. And blood glucose could be a similar thing. So typically with physiology, we don't want to have large deviations from what is our normal. For HRV, it's a bit more complex because we don't have these population level ranges where we say, okay, this is normal and this is not. So you need to collect data for some time. The tool you use then will be able to determine what is your normal. And then when you're outside of that, it could be that it's a situation that is not necessarily good, even if a small or a slow change in HRV over many weeks is typically good when it's increasing. The acute change on a day-to-day basis, so maybe today it's particularly high with respect to your normal and yesterday and so on, that could be an issue, because sometimes when we have very high parasympathetic activity, like it would be in this case, so maybe a suppression in heart rate and very high HRV acutely, so suddenly with respect to what was our data before, it might mean that we are not very well recovered, as we might think if we oversimplify, but it might be a sign that the body is actually very busy trying to recover. So the parasympathetic system is quite active, but that situation doesn't mean that we actually can take a lot more stress that day, quite the contrary. So we need to, I think, be a bit more careful in these situations. In general, a high value is not always so easy to interpret. So even saying that when it's particularly high, it's bad, that is also an oversimplification. It's a bit more complex in those situations with respect to low values, which always signal high stress. High values, I think, are things that we need to combine somehow with our subjective feel as well, if we want to aid the interpretation. So if we know that we experienced a large stressor, then we understand that's a typical response in which the parasympathetic system is too active. Otherwise, if everything is rather normal, it could also be a day in which we don't have to worry particularly.
We'll talk about factors influencing HRV later, but personally, what I experienced in the last few years, I work in events and I have races. I can see a very strong correlation with adrenaline. So if I have a big day or a big event, obviously something that gets me hyped up or nervous, or even probably some poor sleep, next day I have a sky high outlier on the high side with HRV.
Interesting. Yeah.
Next question.
Question, because, well, it
kind of related still, eh?
Yeah, you said it already. Like, it's very individual, I guess, related, but still, like, people want to have clear numbers, I guess, or clear cutoff values, which they don't get, I think. But still, we have those questions here, like, from Bianco Witches. He said, okay, I need to look at the trend. I need to focus on the trend. That's also what Guido has told us in the previous episodes. However, I'm still curious whether the absolute HRV level itself tells us anything and how it can be improved.
Is higher better, and how do we get it up?
Yeah. And maybe the next question, that relates to this, is more like, why is it so different between persons? Where is this variability coming from?
Yeah, those are certainly linked, meaning that, unfortunately, the absolute value is not something, I would say it's not something we understand fully. So, and that means also that typically it's not something very actionable. But context here matters a lot, because when we talk between people that exercise and maybe care about their diet and try to, check the typical boxes of a healthy lifestyle and things like that, then we might have values, absolute values, that are still anywhere in the range of the possible values. And I would say that's pretty much it, meaning that you're already doing the things you should be doing, which is trying to get some sleep and eat a healthy diet and move, do exercise and things like that. There is still no other secret here. It's the main pillars, I would say, of health and performance. But if we do not do those things, which is the case actually for most of the population in many countries, right? Then yes, there is room to improve your absolute HRV, because with basic lifestyle changes, then pretty much any parameter that you can measure would improve. If you just get a blood test and you look at your data and then your lifestyle is not particularly good or healthy, then you can improve all of those numbers by doing these basic things we discussed. So HRV similarly would change in those cases. But I think typically the people that ask these questions are already the ones that have done all the basics and still maybe are somewhat unsatisfied, so to speak, with the absolute value of their HRV, because maybe it's 20, 30 milliseconds, which is a bit lower than what maybe their friends have, because we always compare numbers and things like that. But that doesn't really mean much. It certainly does not determine your ability to perform. It does not determine even your absolute performance level, meaning that elite athletes could be also all over the range, and they do not necessarily have better values than other people. I think this is quite fascinating, because to me it's not so obvious that it links to performance. If we want to look at something that is a bit better correlated, then maybe it's resting heart rate, and we all know obviously there is also large variability there. But if you look at an elite endurance athlete, it is very unlikely that the resting heart rate is not very low. But if you look at their HRV, that could be high, but it could also not be high. It wouldn't really matter that much. So there is a strong genetic component there. I think that's what I'm getting at. It's not just lifestyle. It's not just the choices. It's not just our training. It's also our genetics, to a point that it could explain maybe 50 to 70% of the variability between people, which means that what we do will have an impact, but there's a lot there we might not be able to change.
Can we, maybe a little sidestep with genetics?
Yeah, it's a question of Nancia, also.
What kind of genes are involved, or
no,
personalities, or no.
So I don't think we have a good understanding of what's behind there. Yeah.
Because it's interesting. Thanks for the explanation. Because the question from Timo, I mean, it's a topic that athletes, cyclists are discussing a lot on the morning before a race or on training camp. He explains he was in Spain with his team, and then every morning, and what is your HRV today? Ooh, mine is higher or lower. Oh, how comes? And well, we at the same amount of sleep, or
what I learned from this explanation, Marco, and especially when you say it's also related to genetics, you might as well compare it to a conversation about body length.
Yeah.
Right? That is very different in absolute values from each athlete to athlete, but it does in no way well, maybe in some aerodynamic way, influence performance, and it's something you're just born with? Are you saying HRV is probably something like that? It's different per person, but that's just how people differ.
I think to a great extent, yes. So I don't want to say it's impossible to make changes. Of course, we can always make changes. And genetics means many things. It might mean that we have a certain value. It might also mean that we respond differently when we make a change, right? So some people that might experience a large change in relation to being more active, and others a smaller change, like we do when, in terms of VO2 max or other parameters that change with training. In the context of the cyclist and the training camp, I think a more useful way maybe to look at the data is not what is the value itself, but especially during a camp when you're stressing the body with high load and maybe you're going at altitude, so there is also that stressor. It's useful maybe to look at how is the data changing with respect to your historical data. So for example, if yesterday we went for a very big ride, and today, is your HRV within your normal range, regardless of absolute values, or is it not? Because if it is, then this cyclist could handle the stimulus, the load and the altitude and everything. And if it is not, then maybe there is some adjustment to make. So I think we should be happy to see a positive response, a stable HRV, regardless of the absolute value.
Interesting.
Yes.
Let's move into the next chapter, which is all those questions about measurements. We have several question askers. Luc Walta, Stefan Segers, Mesui weer, Edwin van Anraat, Dennis Maren, and Renske Thalen. Thanks all. And basically all of them kind of are in the area of, okay, which measurement type, which device is the more accurate or not? What should I look at? And I've seen in your blog you have a lot to say about that. So I think I just pitch you this ball, Marco. When it's about measurement and measurement accuracy, what are some of the things that people should be aware of?
I will try to be as politically correct as possible. So we have typically two ways to measure HRV, which is first thing in the morning or during the night. I think that these two ways are the only reasonable ways because we want to measure our physiology at rest. And so that means either first thing in the morning or during the night. But we also want to measure it far from stressors. And
sorry to interrupt, quickly checking. Why do we want to measure it in rest? Why is it important? Because during activity it's all cluttered or polluted?
Yeah, because we want to still measure the effects of the parasympathetic system, which is the one that is active when we are at rest. That is really what HRV is able to capture. So as soon as we exercise or we move and things like that, parasympathetic activity reduces a lot, almost inexistent, I would say, as we exercise at high intensities. And then what we measure is not really anymore that part of that system linked to recovery that we care about. So we want to measure at rest for those reasons. And yeah, the other aspect was far from stressors, because it's important to understand that the goal is not to experience stress, right? The goal is to assess how we respond to stressors. And it is normal that the body goes through changes when you experience the stressor and also after for a period of time, which could be hours, and that is totally normal. It's just a normal physiological response. But then when you assess, you want to assess how you responded to all of these stressors. And if you measure right after the stressor, then you will just be sort of confounded by the fact that you did this specific thing. So if I go running and then I measure later, of course, my physiology will be changed by the fact that I went running. That will not be very informative about the stressors. So I need to do that first thing in the morning because we haven't experienced any stressors yet. So that would be also before breakfast, before having coffee, before we start doing things that impact our physiology. And in the night, of course, we are sleeping. So that is also a good time. In relation to the stressor timing, here, it matters a bit more because, for example, if we train in the evening, or if we have a drink in the evening, or if we eat late and it's a very heavy dinner, then those stressors will impact the night data more, simply because the night comes before the morning. So there will be a stronger acute effect. And that means, in my opinion, that the night data typically is a bit more linked to our previous behavior than it is to our ability to perform and take additional stress the following day, while the morning data can be more actionable from that point of view because it's further away from the previous day's stresses. So there are some differences there, which I think are important, but both these methods in the long term should track similarly in relation to various stresses because still they aim at capturing our chronic response to everything that we do. And that can be done at those times.
Yeah. And so in the morning and away from stressors, I understand now why. Let me now take the opportunity to explain how your app works. So it's not you pitching your own app. So in the last 4 years, I have a routine when I wake up. Okay, this is a sleep thread, but okay, my phone is on my nightstand. It's in flight mode, of course. But as soon as I wake up, before I get out of bed, and I read on your blog, and I think I do it, I from lying down, I get up. You wrote about why that's important as well, or at least I lift my upper body. And then for 2 minutes, I put my fingers on my camera in the app, and the app measures for 2 minutes a so-called PPG, so a visual measurement.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, graphy.
And then, and I think that's also important, we might get to it, I fill out some qualitative parameters about what time I went to sleep, what time I woke up, about the volume of sleep, how I felt I slept, whether I have muscle, well, all those qualitative parameters that we spoke about a few weeks ago. This is one way to measure. Are there other ways to measure? For example, the smartwatches or the rings, how do they measure the HRV?
The Whoop.
Yeah, so these devices use the same technology actually that you just explained, because instead of using the phone to use the flash basically to lighten up the skin and then record a video of your blood flow, you can do that with dedicated hardware like any of the sensors that you mentioned, where there is also there an LED that is flashing a light. Typically, we can see it also in the devices we use for training. It's a typical green LED. And then there is a detector that also will basically capture the reflected light as your blood is flowing. So it's the same principle, but instead of sort of hacking a phone, there is a device that is built for that. And those use the same principles and are, I would say, in terms of the main brands, Garmin watches, Coros watches, Oura rings, Whoop bands, they are all very similar. So if you use them during sleep, when there is no movement, it is really key to these methods, right? So if you use the phone camera, it's easy because you just stay there a minute or two and you know that you should not move. For a night measurement, also you gotta sleep. So movement is limited, right? There will be some movement. Maybe, you wake up and go to the bathroom, or, you turn in bed, but it's small movements that will disrupt a bit the signal, but there is a lot more data there. So still it is possible to get high quality data. And then in those cases, HRV typically is computed at certain intervals, normally every 5 minutes, and then an average of the night is provided. I think that is a good way to do it because still you want to capture again your physiological stress response in a similar way every night. So using the average of the entire night is a good way to do that. And you can get a similar number out of this method. I want to just add one thing, because you mentioned your protocol, and I think that is something I discussed often, because it's another one of the differences between morning and night is that in the morning, you can pick the body position you want to measure in, right? So in the night, typically you are lying down, right? But when in the morning, you can decide to sit up as you do. And that is a very good protocol, is also what is done typically in the scientific literature, because by sitting up, you rely on what we call the orthostatic stressor. It's just a way to say that when you sit up, but your body needs to readjust, right? Because blood is pooling in different parts of the body and it readjusts quickly to the change in body position. And this is what happens in that case, is that if you measure shortly after, let's say within a minute from when you change body position, your measurement tends to amplify the response. That means that it becomes more sensitive. It is easy to see it. So sometimes you have to challenge the body a bit in order to see the response. And that's a way to do it that makes morning data very effective. It's a bit like when we think about blood glucose, and you can measure in the night and as you sleep, and you're resting blood glucose. But then to see how your system works and if you're efficient at the process, basically you use a glucose tolerance test, basically, right? So you ingest a lot of glucose and then you see the response, the spike, and how long it takes to renormalize and things like that. So as a similar principle, you stress a bit the body by sitting up, you take your measurement, and that becomes more useful typically in the context of training. That is a more subtle stressor to capture. So I think that's a good way to do it. But there are always practical considerations, right? I heard many times from users of our systems, for example, when I recommend this, many say, okay, but I have 3 young children that will not let me take a morning measurement. So in this case, maybe another protocol and trying to measure in the night is fine. So there is the best protocol, and there is what works in daily life. So we need to find something in there that works for our specific use case.
Okay, that sounds like consistency is key, like with training programs. That's for sure. But there are different
very good point.
methods, and I was triggered by what Gerrit explained, that in your app you need the combination of the HRV together with the subjective data. That's not included in Garmin or Whoop or Aura, I think. Is that true? And why is it? Yeah, why is the combination so
relevant?
Relevant, yeah, in your opinion.
Yeah. So in my opinion, objective data can only tell us so much. So it is important, I think, to look at this data, especially in the context of training. It gives us an objective assessment of our autonomic nervous system response. But that's not all there is. For example, we were chatting before the starting recording about yesterday's run. I was out for a few hours, right? And it was a big day. And today, my physiology is normal. My HRV is normal. So that is good. It means that I did not overdo it. But my muscle soreness certainly prevents me from doing anything like that.
I'm glad you tell me that, Marco, because for those listeners who didn't hear, you ran 70K yesterday and I just saw your Instagram story with, my HRV are normal, nothing happened. But okay, at least your legs ache.
Exactly. So my legs remind me every second of what I did yesterday. And that's why I think it's always important to combine the objective and the subjective as context, but also because if we want to provide guidance, there is no way that can be automated, because the wearable sensors capture some parameters, but other things they cannot know. And muscle soreness is certainly one thing that cannot be captured with these devices. So, I will be slightly less politically correct now for a second. Some companies prioritize, like everything is automated and we know everything, give you this number and this is the truth.
Yeah.
For us, it's not really like that. So we try to say, okay, this is your physiological response, and we really stick to the physiology and not combine it with all sorts of things. But here is also how you feel, and you fill it up, and you provide your input. And then for the advice, then the two parts are used. So, okay, my app this morning would say, your HRV is normal, but subjectively you are reported that you're not feeling good. So, the advice
this came up in our episode a few weeks ago when we talked about recovery scores aided by AI.
Yeah.
Marco, is it true that in your tool, the subjective scores always surpass the objective measurement, saying that if objective is normal, but subjective says, well, I feel tired or have muscle ache, whatever, you will never give me a green light, right? Always yellow or red.
That is correct. Yeah, that is correct. So if your feel will always be the most important thing.
Okay. Exactly. You wake up the nerd in me. I have a few more questions. One of the things I'm thinking, so I have for 4 years provided you objective data correlated with corresponding subjective data. Are you actually taking that back in and learning and machine learning from those things?
Yeah, well, he knows Gerrit Heijkoop already. Yeah.
It's not about me personally. It can be anonymized, but I'm just curious. Is the tool learning from those things?
Yeah. It is anonymized. I will add this.
Yeah.
But at the same time, so in the past, I thought that was one of the things that interested me the most as a data scientist. I was thinking, okay, we combine this data and find these insights and things like that. And we did some research in the early years and so on. Over the years, my view has changed. So I think that physiology is very individual, that the subjectives are very individual, that context is very individual and also completely unknown to the tool. Like, yeah, sure, you log a lot of things, but if I think even about myself, so much is missing still from everything that happens in a day. So my goal today with these tools is really to try to provide you with the tools that allow you to collect and interpret the data and make sense of it and make adjustments in your life, more than to discover anything at the population level. So I don't mean that it's not possible to do that, but personally, I've shifted a bit mindset. I prefer to provide a tool that helps the individual, and then the data, when we analyze at a large scale, I mean, it was always the obvious things. So, and even when I see other companies now making these announcements, it's always the obvious things. It's, sickness, it's alcohol, like the normal stressors, but it's never really the interesting things in daily life and when you make the meaningful adjustments, because we don't have the context to do that. So I think it's easy to say, it was big data before, now it's AI. We can always use these words and say, okay, we can do this and that. But eventually, I think there is so much individual variability in everything that we do that it's best to have good tools and try to understand things ourselves.
Exactly. Now, back to the different measurement options. As a layman, not having read many of your blogs in the past few weeks, I would say a wearable that is on my wrist or on my finger much more times than the 2 minutes that my fingers are on a camera has probably a lot more and therefore better data than that only 2 minutes a day daily measurement. How does the way we measure, either permanently or in those 2 minutes, how does that affect the reliability and the quality of the data?
It is certainly true that there is more data in the night than in the morning. That I think the important part is really the consistency of the protocol. If we do things right and we measure resting in the morning before doing other things, we will get a very nice snapshot of our resting physiology. And there's plenty of studies that show us that this is highly correlated with the night data, also in terms of absolute values, in terms of relative changes over time. So I think those things at this point have been established to be two ways that are somewhat interchangeable, meaning that you can get similar insights from both. It does not mean that the same person can do one thing and the other every day, because that there are always differences between methods and protocols. So consistency really key. But once you find the method that you prefer, I think both are as valid. What is important to remember about the wearables and these devices is really that the data should come only from the night. Now, there have been even more oversimplifications brought by the use of continuous measurements in wearables in the past few years. In particular, I would say now everybody has some sort of continuous stress monitor and things like that. I think those are not backed by much science. Basically, there's a lot of noise in this data, a lot of artifacts. I can just mention a few examples. Things like drinking water will increase your HRV acutely for the next hours. It has nothing to do with stress. And similarly, there are other physiological processes that are perfectly normal, like digesting, or that will impact your HRV. Many things impact your HRV, but not your autonomic nervous system activity. So HRV represents your autonomic nervous system and stress only in those conditions that we discussed at the beginning. Because if now, for example, I'm talking, or if I swallow saliva, right, then my HRV acutely changes because that causes a change in cardiac activity. Actually, swallowing is quite interesting because we do that like 1 million times per day. And when you do that during the minute in which you were measuring HRV, your HRV will be like 2 or 3 times higher. So are you so much more relaxed if you do that continuously? No, it's just that, there's artifacts all the time. That's why the protocol is really important. And when we take a snapshot, actually, we are controlling as much as possible because we are aware and we are intentionally measuring. And I think that's very powerful to do things right. And then in the night, again, we are asleep. So typically we can trust it unless we move a lot or maybe have an arrhythmia, but those are a bit other situations to consider. So those cases are good, but the device that measures all the time and provides you with these scores continuously, I think we need to be very skeptical of those.
Exactly.
Thank you. Yeah, same holds, I guess, for inspiration, exploration already. Yeah, I mean, it influences your heart rate and your variability. Let's move on with the physiological influences. I have a question from a person called Gerrit Heijkoop. And he says, well,
I submitted my own question.
Yeah, there's increasing knowledge about the differences between the male and the female heart. And that's true. To what extent does this play a role in measuring HRV? Question is, how does a measurement from a woman differ from a man?
I would say we can look at maybe three aspects. So one aspect, well, maybe even four. So one aspect is just basic differences between men and women. Typically, women have a slightly higher resting heart rate with respect to men, but their HRV, typically up to menopause, tends to be similar or slightly higher than men. So that is, I think, quite interesting, because talking about heart rate and HRV, typically you expect the opposite, right? Heart rate is higher, you expect HRV to be a bit lower. So there it could be, again, the role that hormones play that we know are different. And this links also to the menstrual cycle, for example, which is, so for people that experience a regular menstrual cycle, there is a sort of cyclic component also in resting physiology data. So HRV tends to be slightly lower in the second phase of the cycle, the luteal phase, so after ovulation. So typically, and here it's very important to understand that we really talk about the population level. So if we look at many people, typically we see a slight suppression in the second phase and maybe a slight increase in the first phase, the follicular phase. But still there is huge variability between people and also in the same person. That means that this relationship that we can see at the group level might not be obvious in your own data if you have a regular cycle. And even if you see it sometimes, it might not be there every cycle. So there is a lot of variability. Part of it is obviously because HRV is a marker of stress and there's other stressors. So those might confound that relationship. So maybe you're in the phase in which should be a bit higher, but then that phase you're training really hard, or there is another stressor in your life and it will actually be lower. So it's not so obvious that we need to see it in the data. The way you could see it may be better in temperature data, for example, that is more tightly coupled to hormonal changes linked to the menstrual cycle. But it is one additional factor that drives changes. So it's important to have it as context, I think, for people that track it. Another aspect could be during pregnancy, right? That's another big change. So there will also be changes in HRV. Typically, it's a suppression, a decline as the body changes, because you need to provide also for the fetus that is developing. So heart rate will increase and HRV will decrease over the months. Recent research from wearables, speaking to the previous point, that we can still learn something from, deploying data, to the consumer and so on, even though typically in very specific context, right, where we have good reference points like this. So someone is pregnant and then they are delivering, and then we have these very clear reference points and we can look at the data. It has been shown that HRV tends to decrease up to a point, but towards the third trimester, sometimes it picks up again, so it changes direction. There is no explanation I've seen of that is telling us why this is happening. So it's, I don't know, maybe a bit puzzling even that it's switching, but at the moment, that is what has been shown by a few groups. And also there with huge variability between individuals. Some people don't have that relationship at all. So if you do not see it in your data, there is nothing abnormal about it. It's just that it's not the typical pattern, but all sorts of patterns have been shown for healthy pregnancies. So it does not really mean anything. And the final thing I wanted just to add was the third case we can think of was again menopause. And that is a bit more challenging because it can be a very long lasting period, right? So it's more difficult also to study. The wearables have not been out for decades, so we cannot really know that much. We know something from studies looking at people before and after or during perimenopause and trying to look at groups and differences in absolute values. So what we know there is typically that after, so when people are in menopause, you tend to have values that are maybe more similar to the ones of men. So again, the link to how hormones are changing could be what explains some of the differences. In the day-to-day, I think for the regular person that is looking at the data, not that much changes, because you are always going to be look at relative changes with respect to your history. So that is your context. And then as someone that has a regular cycle, you just need to remember that there is one additional stressor that might be behind the changes that you see. It's important to know, just because you don't associate the change otherwise to other stressors, because that could be the one that is behind the change. Yeah.
Exactly.
Thanks.
Super clear, Marco. Super exciting. So I'm detracting a few things. First of all, when you mention the differences, you mention differences in absolute values, of which we already learned, which are not really super relevant. The background behind my question is that we perhaps specifically in this podcast, but we hear a lot of female athletes. I was going to say, what word am I going to choose? I'm thinking between protest or mention or claim that females in general and female athletes are not much included or separated in research and in data. But by your answer, it seems that at least in the research around HRV, this is there is enough data and this is clearly distinguished. Would you confirm?
Yeah, I would say there has been quite a few studies looking at these things, at least during the menstrual cycle and pregnancy, that I think these changes have been documented a few times. It was already done before the wearables and these devices, but it was we were less sure about the outcomes, just because you would get people to have a spot check measurement only once per cycle in a different phase, right? So there is a lot of day-to-day variability and so on. But then there were studies using our apps and other apps already maybe 6-7 years ago, and then replicated again with wearables. So fortunately, there is some good evidence there. Similarly with pregnancy, a lot of very recent studies with wearables. And again, with menopause, I think it's going to get there. It's just that it's a longer time frame to study. But fortunately, it's an application where there has been better research. Yeah.
So a big thank you, I think, on behalf of Charlotte, René, Marloes, Annette, Christine. A lot of our female listeners wanted to know about what's the influence of the menstrual cycle on HRV. A curious sidestep question that I wonder, if I let you know in the app that I'm a female, would you, in my subjective scores, do you also track where I'm in my menstrual cycle?
So you can then log when you have your period, so that you can see it as context in the data. So then when you look at your data, you will see the changes, and you will also see when you annotated that you had your period, and that is context that can be useful to you. Yes.
Exactly. And the answer, the summarizing question was, how much influence does the menstrual cycle have on HRV, and should you adjust your training? And that's our segue. Oh no, we have more factors, but like in conclusion, what would your answer to these female athletes be?
So regarding how much it should influence your data, highly individual. For some people, it's barely there. For other people, it seems these hormonal changes are the only changes that show up so strongly. So it's really individual. I think by tracking, you will see how it works for you.
Yeah.
And should you adjust your training? That is a big question. I think that the research at this point does not back the idea that training should be changed based on the phase of the menstrual cycle. So the people that have done most of this research and most of the work claim there is still not enough evidence that you would get different outcomes by doing so. As everything, I think there's a lot of individual variability, right? So if you're experiencing heavy symptoms, then it is obviously debilitating, and you're going to make some adjustments, and that might work better for you. For other people, it might be different. So I think, again, maybe at the group level, still we don't have strong evidence that should be done. At the same time, individual variability, our experience, and things like that might lead eventually to making some adjustments.
Exactly. No general recommendation. I'm looking at the clock, Jurgen. Shall we do a few more of these influencing factors? I think we covered quite a few, and then we end up with the actionability of the data.
Yeah. So I think one clear effect that is seen by our listeners is the effect of alcohol on HRV. And people ask, why is that so strong?
Yeah, well, alcohol is toxic. Right? It's not something, as everyone that had a bit too much knows without measuring anything probably there is a strong impact there. Our cognitive abilities are gone, and our coordination is also gone. It's toxic for the body, and that is clearly visible in the data. Your sympathetic nervous system will be more active. Your sleep.
But
will
I
be
guess our
disrupted in a
listeners
way.
will say, well, it's only 1 or 2 glasses. So it's not toxic yet, but still it has a huge influence already.
Yeah, the dose makes the poison. Let's always say that, it's not that you cannot have any alcohol, and it's always about the amounts that you have, and that will have an impact. And again, high individual variability. Some people with 1 drink, we already see changes. Other people might not see changes even if they have 2. So maybe the data can also provide some insights at that level. Yeah, I mean, I'm not here to tell you if you should drink or not.
Okay, personal question, Marco.
showing-
Marco, where are you on the stand of alcohol? Because I already 7, almost 8 years ago now, kind of basically stopped drinking. But I noticed something else. In the subjective scores in your app, one of the question is, did you drink alcohol? And then all switches are yes or no. But this one is a little or too much. And obviously, first of all, I'm very happy. I can always score no, I didn't. And sometimes, I must admit, I do have a little. But like, I always wondered, where does this one come from? Is this a personal thing, or is it science-based, or why you're asking it like that?
Personally, I have stopped drinking also a few years ago. So I have removed the question from my questionnaire because I wasn't using it anymore. But it was just a way not to get too technical on alcohol units and things like that. I think people know if they overdid it or not, and again, the context is for you then to see the data and understand.
Yeah, I guess
how
my point is
maybe.
filling it out every day, even on the holiday days where you do drink a little, really makes you conscious of your alcohol use, right? And that already reduces.
Self-awareness helps.
Yeah. Nice. All right. Shall we take a final influencing factor and then we go into the one from Henry van Dijk?
Yes.
Because I think that was peculiar.
Was it the hay fever? Or?
No, the metabolism.
Oh, yeah. Yes. Good question. Because what's the relationship with metabolism? I feel hungrier when my HRV is high. Is there a relation?
All right. So I would say that we do have a relationship between energy balance, we could say. So if we are in a caloric deficit, for example, because we are not eating enough, and our resting physiology, meaning that if we do not eat enough, typically our resting heart rate tends to be lower. I think there's a bit of a energy conservation mode, right? So you want to expend fewer calories. It's a bit like
a winter sleep.
I mean, we are animals after all, right? So we work like that a bit. And as a result, HRV tends to be higher. I saw this a lot with my body weight changes, also talking about self-experimentations and things like that. There's dramatic changes, I would say, in resting heart rate and HRV. And the day you stop being in a caloric deficit, typically it renormalizes very quickly. So it's really an acute response to that. So it could be that maybe this person is sometimes in a bit of a caloric deficit and there is a change in the data. That could explain part of this change.
Wow. Let me make a cliffhanger to next week. Next week, we're talking about intermittent fasting, and I can already give a little preview that I think I have put myself in a caloric deficit in the last month. One of the things I said earlier to Jurgen is, well, I actually see my heart rate going down and my HRV going up, so I think I'm getting super fit. But I'm learning now that it's actually maybe an effect and actually proof that I am not eating enough.
Yes, it is. Why context is so important, and how easy it is to look at the data and associate it to the typical interpretation that we have. But then maybe there is a big factor leading to the change, and the fact that your physiology looks better from a typical point of view, in this case, does not mean that you should go hard and do more, because you are actually in caloric deficit, and then it's a state in which you probably need to manage your stress even a bit better.
Right on time.
Right on time. All of those who want to know more about that, listen in next week, episode 217. Let's go to the last chapters. Yeah. So now what? Now all that we've learned about how to measure and how to interpret and track the data. Remco Schepens wrote us, my HRV is low, but I feel super fit. What should I value most? And I think you've already answered that, Marco, but maybe to underline it one more time.
Yeah, for sure. I think that, the absolute values, again, don't tell us so much. So if your HRV in general is a value that you consider on the lower end of the scale, typically there is absolutely no problem if you're a healthy person. And then if you have HRV that is low today with respect to your normal, so it's just suppression today, and you are still feeling great, I think it just makes you think a bit. If there was some important stressor, it's part of I think an awareness process. It does not mean that the objective data should drive every decision that we make. It's just, I think, useful feedback to better develop also our self-awareness, so that our feel is something that we can use better in the future. I think eventually that is the ultimate goal, right? That we understand and have self-awareness. But that, I think, needs to be trained. It's not an innate ability. I think it's very similar to what we do during exercise, right? I used to run without looking at my heart rate data or anything like that. And I thought I was going easy on many days, but then through the use of data, I learned that I was actually always overexerting myself, and then I was not doing my hard session very well. I was always tired. My training volume was low. By looking at the data, I learned those things. And now I don't need to look at the data, right? I've developed this feel, but this is not something, we are born with, because that is something, people that don't like much to talk about the data or to look at the data often say, yeah, you should just go by perceived exertion and things like that. And ultimately, I agree, but we need to develop that skill. And I think the data can be helpful there as feedback. So always try to balance the two and learn from them. And, if you feel great, you can also try to go hard that day, do the workout that you had planned. And then you see what happens the day after. Maybe it was nothing, and your physiology also renormalizes. But if your physiology continues to be suppressed, then maybe there is something else, and it's time to pay attention.
It's time that I start using some
I was going to say, Marco, I think our listeners and I know a person who just is always rooting for just go by feel. But now, Jurgen, maybe you should be a bit more self-aware.
Yeah. Next question from Wouter. It has a relation, I guess, to allergies and infections and that kind of stuff. He's telling us he has a hay fever, and as a result, the HRV drops significantly from March to September. What can I do with that information? Is there anything practical I can do with this knowledge besides confirming, yes, I do indeed have a runny nose?
Yeah, that's a bit like we said at the beginning. Training is a nice application because you modify the stressor. In this case, it's not so easy to modify the stressor, and indeed, the data just reminds you that you have the stressor. I would say, in a way, it tells you that it's a good time in which maybe we can prioritize things that aid recovery, right? It could be that maybe you pay more attention to just how you eat or how you sleep and how you modulate training. We do what we can in the environment we are in, right? So it's just a reminder that maybe we take better care of those things. And then maybe in other periods where the stressor is not present, maybe we have more room for doing other things or experiencing more stress. It does not mean that you're necessarily limited, but it's just the way that it allows you to think about it.
Yep. So stress is not always a bad thing, huh? I mean, stress is...
Definitely not.
No.
No.
So he better, you can use it, Wouter, as...
Exactly. Neil Behagen, final question. Can you train when it's in red?
Great question, actually. Maybe we didn't touch on this. HRV does not determine your ability to perform. It's more about your ability to assimilate additional stress. So this is good to know, for example, on race day, because on race day, you're not racing to improve, so to speak. Later, likely you will take a longer period of recovery, maybe an off-season. So you just have to execute and perform that day. And typically you can do it unless, of course, your HRV is suppressed because you're sick or there is something major. but sometimes it can be lower even because you have just some excitement about the event, and there's this slightly higher sympathetic drive on that day, and all sorts of things that should not worry you at all. Typically, you can perform well even during training. Typically, if the person feels well and they're not sick and so on, often I could even advise, okay, it's a bad HRV day, do your session regardless. So you also understand that you can execute the session, you can perform well, and that's good to know also when you race and you doesn't get in your head too much, because then it can become a problem that you don't need. So always remember that typically you can execute the workout unless there is some health-related issue, and what is compromised more is your ability to assimilate the stressor, and that is also what we see in the HRV guided studies. So that is when people use HRV to reduce training when it's suppressed. So they do that because doing the training, they would be able to do it, but it would not lead to a better outcome in the future. And that has been shown a few times. So eventually, if we want to use this data, that is a good way to do it. So reduce training intensity when it is suppressed. It does not mean that you cannot execute the training, but it might lead to better outcomes in the long term.
Exactly. Agree. So we put those, there are a couple of meta-analyses and reviews on the topic of HRV-guided training.
Yeah.
And they look, little small positive effects. So I mean, it's worthwhile doing that.
Athletes on the brim are looking for small positive effects.
Yeah. And,
so I think we made full circle, because a few weeks ago, Marco, we mentioned and we announced that we would interview you. And the reason we did is because a few months back, we were just sitting with a few befriended athletes in front of the Amsterdam Marathon who were just looking at their HRV and getting very anxious when Jurgen got the idea we should bring Marco on. And basically, I mean, race day excitement could be actually very well be one of those stressors that influences HRV, but should not worry you too much.
Yeah. Certainly. I will just add one thing. Talking about research, there is probably only one study that looked at morning HRV with respect to performance. And they actually found that the people that had the lowest HRV or these signs of, again, higher sympathetic activity performed better. So not really what you would expect according to the basic interpretations, but on that day it's different.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm looking at the clock, and we always promise our listeners and viewers either approximately a 1 hour easy running training of podcast. I think we already extended that a little bit, but Marco, I want to say it's been really interesting, really fascinating to listen to you. I think you're a very well explainer, and I hope all our listeners are willing to appreciate that as well. And if they have follow-up questions or things they want to reach out to us, let me quickly tell them how to do so. They can follow us and interact with us on LinkedIn as the Slimmer Presteren Podcast. To the international friends of Marco who are listening to this podcast, this stuff is all in Dutch in all the other areas, but maybe you're willing to learn when you visit Marco in Amsterdam. You can follow us and find us as the @Slimmer Podcast on Instagram. We publish the topic of our episode every Friday. You can go to our website, www.slimmerpodcast.nl. There you find a page of each of these episodes, a unique page, a unique URL, which you can pick up and copy and send around and share in your networks. And you can send us an email via post@slimmerpodcast.nl with all your questions, comments, thank yous, follow-up conversations. And I can imagine, Marco, that since we already got so many questions the first time around, if we collect enough, would you be willing to come back on the show?
For sure, no worries.
Perfect. And I think
then in Dutch, okay?
Oh my God, I will not commit to this.
Well, I thought you'd like challenges.
Yeah.
I mean, after finishing that 100K run, you can do a new challenge, learn a new language, see what the stress does with you.
I will switch my Duolingo from Spanish to Dutch.
Exactly. Well, Jurgen, this was a first for us in English. Maybe it's the start of our international career of the Smarter Performance Podcast. Well,
sounds good to me.
I think there's other podcasts in that domain, so we'll remain Dutch for the next few weeks at least. Yep. But I hope you were able to follow well. If you listened this far, I guess you were able to follow us in English. Marco, thank you very much.
Thank you, Marco,
for your presence.
And thank you
Jurgen,
so much.
See you next week.
Volgende week in het Nederlands weer.
Oké.
Tot dan.
Hoi.
Zo, nog even terug in het Nederlands. Goed dat je deze aflevering helemaal tot het einde hebt uitgeluisterd. Want we hebben inmiddels al heel veel afleveringen gemaakt. Meer dan 210. Het onderwerp HRV en overtredingen is al vaak aan bod gekomen. Dus we kunnen ons voorstellen dat je daar misschien wel de diepte over in wil. Jurgen, schijn eens een lichtje op ons archief. Welke afleveringen moeten onze luisteraars gaan opzoeken?
Nou, dan zal ik in de basis beginnen met aflevering 62. Daar leggen we uit wat HRV is en eventueel hoe je het kan meten en ja, waar het een afspiegeling van is en hoe je het kan gebruiken. Misschien in een optimaliseren van je training en wat de wetenschap daarover zegt.
Er zit een stuk overlap met de aflevering van vandaag, maar we gaan verder de diepte in. Wat nog meer?
Nou, we hebben het over de invloed van de menstruatiecyclus. En daar krijgen we ook veel vragen over. Niet alleen wat die invloed is op HRV, maar ook misschien sportprestatie. Luister dan aflevering 136 en 202. Daar hebben we Merel Wielink en Dionne Noordhoff die hier tekst en uitleg over geven.
Ja, nog meer?
Ja, want we hadden het er al over. Red je het alleen met HRV of is het ook goed te kijken naar andere data? Bijvoorbeeld readiness to train. Hoe voel je je? Heb je er zin in je training? Nou, daar hebben we het over gehad in aflevering 56. Over het belang van, of het gebruik van kwalitatieve data.
Ja.
Bij het opstellen van het trainingsprogramma. Wat als jij merkt van je HRV gaat echt omlaag. Oh jee, overtraining wellicht. Nou, luister dan aflevering 59.
Kortom, een heel boodschappenlijstje waar je nog uren mee vooruit kan. Als je denkt, waar vind ik deze aflevering nou snel? Kijk in de show notes. Daar staan directe linkjes naar de pagina's van de website. Of zoek in je favoriete podcast app op de woorden Slimmer Presteren en dan menstruatie, HRV, kwalitatieve data of overtraining. En dan vind je ze vanzelf.